Do humans build technology and code AI in their own image? And are the authors of science fiction any better? My guest and I are going to test our author for this episode by just such a rubric, and humanity may be destroyed in the process. I'm Angus Stewart, and you're listening to the Translated Chinese Fiction podcast. So our story is The Fundamental Nature of the Universe, and it's by one of New Wave Chinese sci-fi's fathers. I don't know if that's the right noun. I would say it's about right. One of its three fathers, Han Song, who's up there, although not quite on Liu Cixin's level. And our guest is also highly esteemed. It's Nathaniel Isaacson. But before those two, or at least that one guy and the other guy's story, enter the picture, we have The News. The Translated Chinese Fiction News is a new segment. I'm going to try and do this on every episode, along with a word of the day. If I forget, pelt me with eggs. So our first news item is not exactly hot off the presses. It's from August. Possibly it was news, it was a developing story before that. But basically, I've got a little article in front of me posted on Simon & Schuster's website, letting us know that they've released the cover for Vagabonds by Hao Jingfang, which is an English translation of her story that was previously going under the title Stray Stars, Liu Lang Xing, I think. And it's, if you look at the plot synopsis, I'll just give you the kind of, not the plot synopsis, the blurb. So there's a colony on Mars that kind of broke away from Earth and has pursued something like a socialistic or communistic way of living. Meanwhile on Earth, capitalism is spiraling out of control or something like that. So if you know of Ursula K. Le Guin, or if you've read her book The Dispossessed, you might be thinking this sounds like Hao Jingfang's take on The Dispossessed. I don't know if she wrote it with that intent, but that's certainly the immediate way that I think about this book. So yeah, that's something that will be coming out through, I guess, quite a few different publishers. I believe in the UK it's going to be Head of Zeus, but in any case, that'll be coming to us in ebook and physical form next year. It's a Ken Liu translation, as one might expect, but it looks a little different. The cover is quite different from a lot of other Chinese sci-fi titles we've seen. It's certainly not branded to look like Liu Cixin's books, and it doesn't really look like Broken Stars or Invisible Planets either. So that's very interesting. Our second piece of news, this is also a Hao Jingfang. It's not really news, this is news to me. I found out that she speaks English, and there's a bunch of interviews that you can find with her on YouTube. Quite a few of them were uploaded by CGTN, which is the name, or I guess these days the new-ish name, I know it's been rebranded as of a few years ago, of the Chinese state's English language international news channel, kind of like the Chinese equivalent of RT, Russia Today. But, you know, obviously just because it's kind of a soft power channel doesn't mean everything on there is bad. There's actually a lot of interesting stuff that they put up there, and among that they seem to have done quite a few videos with interviews with Hao Jingfang, or panels that have Hao Jingfang on them. There's also another video uploaded by the Dialogue of Civilizations Research Institute. I haven't checked if that's a Chinese one or not, but there's a really interesting interview that Hao Jingfang does with, it's I think partly about the future of humanity and the rise of AI, but she also talks about a project she's involved in, just educating kids. I think they're disadvantaged kids, because as we talked about in the episode on her, she does deal with inequality and poverty for her day job in her think tank or her advisory body. So yeah, if you want to learn more about Hao Jingfang, just head onto YouTube. There's stuff there, which I tried that with Xia, and there's no Xia interviews on YouTube, but there's a wealth of Hao Jingfang, so worth checking out. The next item of news, this is more recent. This isn't hot off the presses, given the medium of podcasting is not really great for that, but this is recent news. So The Guardian, the British newspaper, announced its best science fiction and fantasy books list for 2019, and our guy Chen Qiufan and his book Wastetide are in there. I'll just read you the section on him. This is reading directly from The Guardian's webpage post on the said winning books. Chen Qiufan's Wastetide, published by Head of Zeus, is set on Silicon Isle, a dumping ground for the world's discarded computers and tech trash. There's an old school cyberpunk quality to the book, and though its plotting is a touch choppy, it's a compelling reflection on a world defined by its waste. So, again, well done Mr. Chen, well done Stan, that's very awesome. Another item of news, and you can get the sense I'm catching up with a backlog here. This might not be the norm for each episode, but just this past month, I think in late November, the 5th China International Science Fiction Conference was held, and this year it was held in Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan province, and notice they were branding a lot of their social media presence with pandas, sci-fi pandas, because of course Sichuan and Chengdu are the home, or Sichuan is the home of the panda, Chengdu is the home of the panda, what do you call it, like the breeding center, panda exclusive. Actually it's not panda exclusive because they have a red panda. Anyway, the number one panda center in the world, which I have visited. So yeah, I'll just read, there's a wee write-up here posted on gochengdu.cn. I'll just read the whole thing really quickly. The 5th China Chengdu International Science Fiction Conference came to a successful end on November 24th in Chengdu, witnessing the exchange of scintillating ideas on sci-fi culture and sci-fi industry at discussions and forums. The 3-day event brought together about 60 guests from 14 different countries and over 300 well-known sci-fi writers, scholars, and industrial insiders from China. That should be industry. Industry insiders from China. While a series of activities, including forums, exhibitions, book signings, and film screenings were staged, attracting more than 52,000 participants. I wonder where they got that number. The views online of the opening ceremony and awarding ceremony for Galaxy Awards exceeded 568,000. Nice. Chengdu has made great efforts in recent years to push forward the sci-fi culture industry and has bidden? There's a couple typos here, bidden to host the 81st World Science Fiction Convention in 2023. Dubbed as the Capsule of science fiction in China, Chengdu is the cradle of China's most popular sci-fi magazine. Oh, I did not know this. Science Fiction World, which has cultivated quite a few sci-fi writers like Liu Cixin, Wang Jingkang, and He Xi. Haven't heard of He Xi before, that's interesting too. Chengdu is taking the lead in China in sci-fi related topics. Some of the best known sci-fi novels for the sci-fi blockbuster, that is a typo as well. Anyway, some of the best known sci-fi novels like the sci-fi blockbuster The Wandering Earth and Crazy Aliens were created in Chengdu, while top-notch animation creative teams engaging in sci-fi movies such as Ne Zha and 100,000 Bad Jokes have headquarters in the city. With the development of that's another typo. With the development of the sci-fi industry, Chengdu is expected to achieve more fruitful results in the fields of the future. Interesting phrase. And I believe that Chengdu University, one of the universities in Chengdu, has launched a science fiction studies department or course or publication. I forget which, but it looks like Sichuan and Chengdu might be a little hub. They certainly seem to be being developed as a hub for Chinese sci-fi. So watch this space. Get it? Space, because sci-fi, space. Okay, last news item. This is dating a few days back from recording. It'll be even later from posting this episode. But on the 29th of November, Paper Republic, who I've mentioned on the show many times before, that's a kind of a organization for the promotion, I suppose, of translated Chinese fiction. The place that I link to when I want to direct listeners to info about authors and translators. Just an amazing organization run by some of the best translators going. They became a charity. I'll just read you the Facebook event page's details. It probably tells you what you want to know. So just bear in mind this event's already happened. I'm just reporting on it. I didn't attend, by the way. It was in London a little bit. In theory, I could have gone, but I've been going north and south quite a lot the last few months. Just thought I'd save myself some money and time and not go this time around. Anyway, here's the event description. Paper Republic is now registered in the UK as a charity, and we think that's something to celebrate. If you're in the UK, we'd love for you to join us at 6:30 PM on Friday to spend an evening with translators, authors, publishers, readers, and other friends of Paper Republic. And they had a raffle, goodies, drinks, balloons, all that cool stuff. And here's one for you guys. If you can't make it, you can still make a contribution through PayPal. So yeah, you can now support Paper Republic with your money, and they're scheming to do more events like this in the United States and in China proper, and I'm hoping more in the UK, because I'd love to attend one of these. And we should stress, these aren't just for people in the industry, these are for anyone. These are for, I suppose, the most important people to get into these events arguably are the readers. People who buy the fiction and read the fiction. So if you're a fan of the show and you're anywhere near London or you have an internet connection, keep an eye on Paper Republic, because I suspect we'll be seeing more cool stuff like this from them. And even if you are stuck in your house with the internet connection and you have no intention to ever leave your house except to go shopping, check out their website. It is fantastic. And that is all we've got for the news today. Time for the plugs. So I've been yakking for so long doing the news, I'll just do these plugs quickly. So if you want to contribute to this show, you can go through buymeacoffee.com, or to get access to some bonus content, you can go through Patreon. Links are in the show notes. Otherwise, the website's address /TrChFic, TrChFic, that will bring you straight to me. You can get in touch with me or get sneaky updates and previews about what the show is doing via my Twitter @AngusLikesWords, or the show's Instagram account @TrChFic, TrChFic. I did a little guess who the next author will be thing on there just tonight, although by the time this comes out, that'll already be over, but that gives you an idea of what I put on there for you guys, the listeners. Yeah, that's there's one more thing in the plugs. It's Facebook. So I made a Facebook discussion group and a page. Check them out. I'd like to see if that's a good platform for promoting the show. It may not be. If not, that's fine, but you never know if you don't try. So all news and all plugging aside, let's get on with the interview and listen to what Nathaniel Isaacson had to say about Hansong. Okay, so I've got Nathaniel Isaacson on the show, or on the line with me. He's the author of Celestial Empire, He's the author of Celestial Empire, The Emergence of Chinese Science Fiction. So how's it going, Nathaniel?
I'm doing quite well, thanks. This is the Thanksgiving week here in the United States, so the semester's sort of winding down, and I don't have a whole lot to do, at least in terms of my teaching duties. So bit of relaxation lately.
Have you eaten the turkey yet?
No, that's Thursday, so looking forward to that.
Okay, you got time to gear up for that. That's good.
Yeah.
So
how are you?
I'm good. Yeah, it's lovely rainy weather outside. I'm hoping it clears up before I can walk my dog. And it's been a podcast day. I just posted the last episode, the previous episode on Fei Dao today. That was 19. This one will probably be 21. So there's some time travel involved there. I'm trying to think if we're like a time capsule, if that makes sense. This will come out well after Thanksgiving.
Yeah, cool. I look forward to hearing the one on Fei Dao.
It's already up. You can hop to it once I hang up on you.
Okay.
But yeah, chit chat aside, we met at the same place that I met previous guests, Liu Guanzhao and Michelle Dieter. That was the Leeds Center for New Chinese Writings Symposium on Chinese Genre Fiction. And am I right in thinking you were one of the keynote speakers? Was that your designated?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, keynote speaker. The very first speaker, I think. And your topic was a really interesting one. It was like an interesting angle on Chinese sci-fi, I think, from what I remember, historical and present. Can you tell the listeners a wee bit about it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was a bit of a schizophrenic talk. It's sort of an introduction to a larger project that I have where I'm trying to trace a history of development and narratives about the Anthropocene and about the extractive industry in China. And I'm using the figure of the train as a way to get at that. And so the talk that I gave at the Leeds Symposium sort of jumped between two unlikely places. The first one being the late Qing Dynasty and pictorial depictions of trains, and then the 21st century and Liu Cixin and Han Song's depictions of transportation and development. And I guess my argument there, I think in a nutshell, what I was trying to get across was that during the late Qing, at least prior to the Sino-Japanese War, there wasn't quite as much technophobia as has been previously assumed going on in China. And then moving into the 21st century, I'm sort of really interested in examining narratives that are about development and that are both sort of critical of and positive about the sort of breakneck developmentalism at all costs attitude that seems to me to pervade in China today.
It occurred to me as soon as I asked this question that the listeners, unless they already know you, they don't know what your job is. So this isn't just a hobby, this study, right?
Oh, no, absolutely not. I'm an associate professor of Chinese language and literature at North Carolina State University. Through a series of very fortunate accidents, I've come to kind of focus mainly on Chinese science fiction, and I would say more broadly the history of science in China, or narratives regarding science in Chinese culture.
That's cool. We'll get more onto questions about you at the end, but one just popped into my head. So since you said you're looking at narratives of science and history of science, does that bring you into contact with academics who are scientists, or are you kind of in two separate little lanes or spheres?
I think in some ways it does, or at least people who are more properly actual historians of science. So I think maybe they're not actually practicing science, but these are people who know more about science than I do. And this may come up in more detail later on with the questions. But I've been looking at the ways that proper science has been popularized in China. I'm especially interested when I get the chance in the 1950s and the Mao era
Right.
and how science was popularized.
Because that was the whole government's use of sci-fi that was published. That was effectively what it was for, right? To popularize
Yeah,
science.
yeah. And so one of the arguments I want to make, or I want to help people become aware of, and I guess encourage others to examine more, is the ways that we see science fiction as not existing in China during certain periods of time. But I think that really depends on how you define science fiction. And so this popular
Mm,
science stuff, I think is one way to really see how China did some really fascinating things with fictional narrative forms and science combined in ways that we might not immediately think of as SF, but
right.
but that seem to have elements of both of those two things there.
I can say that myself as just a reader or consumer, and then later a young man who did a dissertation on Chinese sci-fi. What I knew about or was able to focus on was kind of determined by what existed in translation. So I knew that. Well, I later during my studies found out that there was Qing era sci-fi and I guess also Republic of China era sci-fi, Mao era sci-fi. But that's not the stuff you can easily find in English. So it's cool that you're studying that.
Thank you. I mean, I think that's partly true, and I'd have to say that's true for myself too. That I have to find what's available in English. But this is also, I think, there's a shift in how China is understanding science fiction and what they're seeing is there. So when I started doing this, a little bit more than a decade ago, I guess, was when I started really diving into this. Chinese literature scholars would say, "Oh, there's science fiction in China," and they kind of couldn't imagine it. And of course,
Mm,
nowadays that's sort of a crazy question. I think everyone
right.
at least knows that it exists. So you wouldn't be alone in having a hard time identifying it, because I think for a long time that's been the case, that people just didn't know that it was there, and sort of more science fiction narratives in Chinese are being unearthed all the time.
Right. That's a good word for it, unearthed. So our story for this episode, it's certainly not Qing era or Mingguo or Mao era. This is a post-Reforman opening up era sci-fi story. So it's by Han Song, who I guess you mentioned trains earlier. People who know Han Song might understand why Han Song would be your guy. And the story is the fundamental nature of the universe. So it says here in my notes who wrote this story. I just answered that. The question I wrote after that in my notes says, "What's your connection to it?" I've hinted at that, but can you tell us a wee bit more?
Well, I'm a huge fan of Han Song, I'd have to say. So anytime I get a chance to translate his work, I'm always jumping on that opportunity. I actually ended up translating this on assignment, I would say, for the journal Chinese Literature Today.
Hmm.
But the ideas in here, I think, really resonated for me, especially what it has to say about artificial intelligence. And then I also like it as, just a work of flash fiction. It's super short, and very disturbing. And I think that's one of the things that actually I really end up enjoying about Han Song, and in literature more broadly. He has outside of his science fiction themes, I think he has a lot of other themes that really resonate with me.
I'm just working my way through Broken Stars right now, and just serendipitously last night, before I went to sleep, I read Submarines and Salinger and the Koreans by him, and yeah, definitely Dark is one way to describe what he's writing. I was wondering about this story that you said it appears in Science Fiction Today. I know that my academic access from my master's at Edinburgh Napier hasn't expired, so that let me get my hands on the story. And I guess anyone else with a standard university academic access could probably get this story by finding the right link, which I'll put in the show notes. But for anyone who's not in a university, is there an easy way to read this story?
I mean, I know this is Chinese. It's Chinese literature today, actually, not science fiction today.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. Just thought we'd want to set that straight.
Chinese literature today. Yeah.
I mean, it's published in basically a magazine format, and I've, since I'm the one who translated it, I got a free copy, of course. But I think the idea here is to make this very accessible. So I'm assuming that if one were to go on Amazon or something like that, hopefully it's available. And
so there might be like a commercial version as well as an academic PDF.
Yeah, I think so. And then actually, I'm on their website right now.
Oh, good.
And yeah, I mean, this is behind an academic paywall, I guess. So that you may have to, I wonder. Yeah, I can't say for sure. I hope it's available because I know one of the sort of masthead missions of this journal is to make things both translation and enterprise that works for the translators in terms of actually getting paid a little bit to do it, and to make translation of Chinese literature more accessible to a broader audience. So hopefully they're succeeding on those terms.
Yeah. After we're done, I'll maybe have a look around online and see if there's a place where someone can get physical copies or e-copies. But yeah, so am I right in saying, well, I know I'm right in saying because I have the paper in front of me, but you're the translator of this story, right?
Yeah, I am.
Yep. Did you have to work in partnership with Hansong whilst you were working on it, or was it a solo kind of thing?
I would say it was more of a solo kind of thing. I often, I guess sort of serendipitously, because I really like his work, it seems like a lot of it ends up going towards me because apparently other translators are not as interested in snatching it up, or maybe I've just somehow gotten a lot of opportunities, so that's really great. But it's often the case that when I send him my translations of his work, he usually seems to say that he likes them a lot and not to have a whole lot of corrections. And so I'm not sure exactly what's behind that, but I think it works really well for me in kind of taking some of the pressure off. I actually have sort of an anecdote I could share about translating another work of his, The Passengers and the Creator, which came out in the magazine Renditions. And there's a scene in that where a man is aboard an airplane with a number of other passengers, and they're sort of incessantly circling the globe. They don't really know where they are or why they're there. It seems that they've lived their whole lives out on this airplane, and so they don't even really know what an airplane is. And he's looking out the window of the airplane, and he sees these sort of tangerine-colored lights blinking. And to the reader or the translator, it sounds like he's looking at the lights on the wing of the airplane. But the narrator doesn't know that. And so I emailed Hansong and I said, is this what's going on? Is he seeing these lights blinking? And then there was a passage later on where he's seeing these sort of whirls of lights below. And it sounds like he's seeing traffic and streets. And Hansong's reply via email was basically, that sounds like a really interesting interpretation. Maybe that is what's going on. And I actually kind of enjoy that I feel like I really have a freedom to let the story unfold as I see it. It's sort of a reflection of Bart and the notion of the death of the author. I really don't feel like he's trying to interpret his own work, and so that's actually very nice when you're translating it.
So the author might be dead. The translator, is the translator alive? There's a philosophical question.
Not sure. I mean, I'm trying to work that out, I guess, and I think that's really one of the wonderfully fun parts of translation is figuring out how much to insert myself and how much to interpret the author's work, and how much adaptation I should do to make those stories work for an English language audience. There are these sort of quirks of Chinese that I guess over time I'm sort of gradually learning my own strategies for, but it's always interesting. I think like one thing that we see a lot of in Chinese are forms of repetition, or
Mm,
use of three or four synonyms in the same sentence for an adjective, maybe. And I like to try and bring some of the flavor of that across, but I don't know if that always works very well in English. In English, we're taught not to be repetitive.
yeah, yeah, you've
Um,
got trade-offs to make.
so yeah, I guess depending how to what extent the translator should die as well is yeah, philosophical question, as you said.
Uh, yeah, I asked that question with absolutely no thought as to what it could mean. I just thought it sounded cool, but that's philosophy for you.
Well, and that's my approach to a lot of things, so I appreciate it.
Um, one more question that's just popped into my head before we talk about the author and the story. You were talking about this. Sorry, what was the name of the story on when everyone's on the plane?
The passengers and the creator.
Okay, so there's the passengers and the creators, where the society are on a plane. The one I just read, submarines. There's a section of society who are only in submarines, and as I understand it, his underground and his railway novels are they kind of the same as well?
Yeah, those are people trapped aboard subway trains or high-speed rail. I think this is a very prominent theme in Hansong is
Mm.
people sealed inside these various modes of transport who are unaware of the true nature of reality outside of their kind of sealed chamber.
So the pop culture question this is prompting me to ask is, have you seen Snowpiercer, the Korean slash international Hollywood American film?
Yeah, I have, and it's eerily reminiscent of Han Song's work.
Mm,
Yeah, if you like Han Song, you absolutely should see Snowpiercer, and if you like Snowpiercer, you absolutely should read Han Song.
there you go,
Um,
amen.
as far as actually being able to find a copy of The Passengers and the Creator, that's available in the edited volume, The Reincarnated Giant.
Oh, that's on my bookshelf.
Yeah, and I know that that is readily available if any readers are looking for that.
Hmm. Cool. I've picked that one up in the last episode, well, episode 19 actually. I've not read it yet. I've read one story that's in it, but I read that by PDF. But yeah, there's a treasure trove of stuff in there, even if it is a
Yeah,
bit pricier than the Ken Liu anthologies.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So let's charge on. What's the elevator pitch or the story synopsis for the fundamental nature of the universe?
I don't know if this necessarily comes in the order that it comes in the plot, but basically what happens in the story is that an artificial intelligence program that has been tasked with babysitting humanity gets bored and sets off, I think, what is maybe some kind of nuclear conflagration or something else like that, where it sort of just releases the entire arsenal at the hands of humanity and destroys life on planet Earth. Um, Shortly after that, an alien being shows up who turns out to be the plenipotentiary representative of a figure called the Guardian. And the Guardian is some sort of godlike figure who is in charge of keeping order in the universe, apparently. And as the conversation between this artificial intelligence program and the Guardian's representative goes on, we come to realize that humanity actually destroys itself every 500 years because it gets bored, much like the AI did, and that it seems that the Guardian, over the course of even more millennia, has also gotten bored and just sort of decided to destroy life and then allow it to start over again. And so the key word sort of in the story is ennui,
Mm,
and we seem to be coming to find out that that is the fundamental nature of the universe, is this feeling of ennui.
yeah, which maybe tells us more about Han Song than the universe, but it's an interesting conceit.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, or I think maybe it's a statement about the fundamental nature of humanity, perhaps, is kind of how I read the story.
Although I've got in my notes here, so we learn that all the kind of players in this story, the Guardian, so the kind of god who lives inside the universe or whatever it is, the alien who's the representative of the Guardian, and the humans, and even the AI inside the supercomputer, they've all got this problem with ennui. And it seems to be especially linked to kind of boredom. I suppose boredom is part of ennui, But if I was going for like a children's edition with a simpler vocabulary, I would probably just swap it out for boredom.
Yeah, I think this is a real challenge of translation, which is that the Chinese word that he uses actually is yan juan,
Mm.
which means something like boredom, but also being tired or weary. And there are actually a few spots where I ended up using different phrases than ennui. And,
Mm.
I wanted to, as much as I could, find a single term that would translate for this feeling. And I think the children's version, or maybe even adults version, boredom might work better or at least just as well. I felt like
Mm.
ennui had sort of this sense of existential angst to it.
Yeah.
Maybe that's based on my own misreading of French culture or something like that, and knowing that this is a French term.
I much prefer German words nicked into English than French words.
Yeah, if only I had the vocabulary, maybe I could have come up with one from German.
Angst. But I think
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
not
that
quite
would
right
have,
though, is it?
yeah. But it's getting there, and I mean that's the fun of translation, right? Is sort of testing those out, seeing what works better and why it works better,
Mm.
or in what ways it might work better and what ways it might not.
Yeah, so I've got a more kind of story related question that follows on from the fact that all the characters or players in the story are suffering from ennui. I kind of buy them all. I can buy like, I know what humans are like. I know that we could have this problem. The alien, sure, he seems quite human, and a god, why not? If it's a living, thinking thing, sure, it might get very bored of its job. But the AI, given that if it is just a computer and it's not bothered about time, I wondered if there is a logic to the reason why it makes the choice it does, or if it's just Han Song kind of playing a trick for the conceit of the story. What's your take on the AI making the decision it does?
I mean, I guess I sort of read this, if the guardian is a God figure, and there's this idea in the Judeo-Christian tradition anyway that we are made in God's image.
Right.
But I think you could sort of flip that around and say that we made God in our image, and so God gets bored as well. Um, I think another potential problem with AI is that we make AI in our own image, and so to
Ah,
me, yeah, ideally a computer would not get bored, but I'm really fascinated with the idea that we program AI to have some of the same foibles that human beings have, and so that's why it would get bored is because it is something that is made in our own image.
which leads us to the article you suggested as like a paired reading with this story, and
Yeah.
it's by a sci-fi author who got name dropped, I think at least once in this sci-fi season. Chen Qiufan mentioned him and said he's a genius, and it's probably true. But as well as being a genius, the author Ted Chiang writes in BuzzFeed, or he's written at least once in BuzzFeed. And although I guess we associate BuzzFeed with fluff and silly polls, his article in BuzzFeed is called "Silicon Valley is Turning into Its Own Worst Fear." So, how would you summarize the essay and the argument Ted Chiang's making? And third and final question about that. How would you say it relates to this Han Song story?
Okay. Well, I would summarize that article basically as that Ted Young's argument is that folks like Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla, or the leadership of Google, and sort of other Silicon Valley tech moguls are warning us about the potential negative consequences of a fully conscious artificial intelligence system. But his argument is that they're worried about that because they too are sort of imagining artificial intelligence in their own image. And so the
Mm.
example he gives is you might have a computer program that was designed to grow strawberries in the most efficient way
We should say
possible.
this is Elon Musk's example that Ted's quoting,
Oh,
right?
yeah, sorry, my apologies. I haven't reread this in a little while.
Ah,
But that the
I read it last
the
night.
Good, thanks. That's helpful for me.
Yeah.
And so Elon Musk imagines this strawberry growing program that would sort of wipe out the entirety of humanity to just turn the planet into a giant strawberry field. And Ted Chiang's argument is that when we look at that, we're sort of imagining artificial intelligence, I guess not so much in the image of a human being as in the image of a corporation.
Oh, Mitt Romney says those are people.
Yeah, and that's sort of one of the interesting, maybe not so random connections that I had seen with that too, right? And I think that really that's what I get out of Ted Chiang's argument, even if it's not already there, which is that we already have these forms of artificial intelligence that are willing to put the life of the planet at risk for the sake of their own benefit, and those are corporations, right? And so people like Mitt Romney are willing to say that corporations are people, and our legal system grants all kinds of rights to corporations as if they were individuals, but they actually have very few legal responsibilities that individuals would have, and so that's I think it's hard for me to separate Ted Chiang's own argument and then the interesting ways that you and I are both taking this, right? With what are sort of the consequences of that if AI is made in the image of a corporation, and if a corporation in a certain sense is a form of artificial intelligence that functions outside of the human beings who work for it. So yeah, that's my very poor summary of Ted Chiang's article. In terms of relating that back to Han Song, I see kind of the same thing going on there. Is there's this puzzle as to why this computer program would get bored and do what it does. I actually think one of the kind of funny things for me is that if the computer has destroyed humanity because it was bored, now what's it going to do? It kind of reminds me of other things I might do to relieve boredom. And so I've managed to take care of feeling bored for that few minutes of time or whatever. But then there's just, I'm still bored and I still have nothing to do. So like if you're on an airplane and you don't really want to eat the food, but you just go ahead and eat it anyway because it's something to do. And then that experience is over and you're just even more bored. So I kind of wonder what the AI is going to do next. But yeah, I sort of see this as perhaps one of the things he's hinting at is that humanity has made this AI that functions in a way that is perhaps too similar to the ways that human beings think.
Also, I think if you close read the story, because it's written in first person from the AI's the narrator. He's for a robot or a intelligence that should be fairly neutral and objective. It seems to judge the humans in its narration and its conversation with the alien. It doesn't seem to think very much of us, or at least what we've become.
No, it doesn't. And I mean, it's capable of deception too, right? Which is supposed to be kind of one of these hallmarks of true artificial intelligence, according to like the Turing test and whatnot. That if it can deceive others and it has sort of this theory of mind for this alien civilization that it's visiting. I think it's only because he tells us that it's an AI that we know that it's definitely not written to sound like a stereotypical robot.
Right, and again, going off the idea of like having you're having your AI have a neutral point of view, going off what you're saying, Ted Chiang's saying about how corporations have become these kind of self-driving things. So right now in the UK, we have a national election coming up, and the leader for the main opposition party, Labour, is Jeremy Corbyn, and we're being told by all sorts of commentators how insane and ideological he is. And yet, if you look at the way the laws are set up to allow large businesses to operate, to me that's the crazy stuff. That's the alien stuff. But things don't get framed in that way. So when you or me or lots of people read Ted Chiang's article and he describes how insane the behavior of some of these companies would be if we considered them people, that's common sense. That's the common sense thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like American politics, I guess we're kind of glad to see ourselves reflected in some other situations, however depressing that may be. I think over here, Donald Trump has managed to phrase things as being sort of a working class warrior, and the folks who are really in charge are the corporations, and that's who he has benefited in the long run. So yeah, very similar situation in the end, I would say.
Yeah, it's weird times. It is very weird times. Um, Not segueing at all. The order of questions I was going to do is now a little bit jumbled. Um,
Sorry about that.
oh, it's not your fault. It's my fault. It's not that it's a problem. So there's quite a lot of ideas in this wee story that's short enough, like you said. We could call it flash fiction. And the idea that tickled me the most wasn't actually anything to do with the main plot. I loved the idea of the Guardian, who is some sort of all power or omnipotent or almost omnipotent thinking thing that's governing the universe. But I think in the story it says it's not a god and it's not outside the universe. And that just set me off thinking like, okay, so does this thing have a physical presence? How hands-on or hands-off is it? After we find out that if it stops kind of monitoring things, entropy will increase and effectively that'll be the end for all life. I don't necessarily have a question. That really tickles me. I just wonder if that concept was exciting to you, or if there's other things in the story that are more like scratch your itch, things maybe to do with the AI.
I mean, yeah, I find the figure of the Guardian really interesting, and I guess I agree with your argument that it's not exactly godly because it's not outside of the universe. But it does seem very godlike, and I think one of the things that really actually interests me about Chinese science fiction more broadly is that on the public front, there's the most sci-fi authors, I would say, are very clear that they are atheists and that China is an atheist country. But you see a lot of religious themes going on in their work. In Chen Qiufan's Waste Tide is centered all around all kinds of religious rituals, right? And it's not really clear if those are meant to be actually effective in kind of spiritual terms, or if those are just effective ways for human beings to cope with the world around them. Liu Cixin, I think, also has a lot of themes that to me seem religious and even potentially Christian. So yeah,
Right.
I think I share your interest in that idea that there are these kind of pseudo-religious ideas that we have to work out, I think on kind of an individual level for our own personal reading of the story, but there's certainly a lot of that there, in this story and Chinese sci-fi more broadly.
Yeah, when you mention Liu Cixin, two things immediately jump out at me. One is in ThreeBody, I think the people who become I forget the name of their organization, but the people on Earth who kind of betray humanity and are working for the Tri-Solarans, the alien invaders, they refer to, I guess, the whole alien race as the Lord, at least in the English translation. I don't know how they're referred to in the original Chinese. And the other one's the short story Taking Care of God, where it almost seems like a parody of the Judeo-Christian God, where it's like all these little individual white old men with big white beards come down from the heavens. And again, I don't know if that could be like Lao Tzu or something, if he fits that description as well. But to me, as a Western reader reading the English one, it felt like it was at least playing with that old kind of idea of what God might look like if he was a person.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there are a lot of cults kind of that spring up in Liu Cixin's work. And I think a major theme in ThreeBody to me is the idea of sacrifice, right? And so I think in one sense you can read that as kind of a very communist or sort of socialist realist type theme where someone is willing to give up their body for the good of the collective body. But that also sounds, it sounds very Christian. Yeah, really fascinating stuff.
Yeah. So if anyone who's listening has thoughts on this or has read other Chinese sci-fi that fits this pattern, zap me a message on Twitter, Angus Likes Words, or there's the Instagram at TrChFic, or even my email or my Facebook, wherever you can hunt me down and find me. It's always interesting to hear from people. I think I have one more question for you that's about the story. Not particularly. I do have a kind of a publishing type question. So obviously you helped bring this story into English in Chinese literature today. Do you know where it began in its original language in publication?
I'm not exactly sure. I know that I have it in a collection. I assume that being as short as this it uh potentially appeared in 科幻世界, but I don't want to say.
That's
Yeah,
science
I'm
fiction
not
world,
sure.
right?
Yeah.
That's something we could mention that I've not mentioned in this whole sci-fi season is the top magazines in China for sci-fi. So I know 科幻世界, science fiction world is one of them, and I know there are others that are on the tip of my tongue, but it's escaping me. Are you familiar with these kind of magazine type publications?
I know that 科学文艺 is another one where at least some of Han Song's early work showed up.
Mm,
And beyond that, I have to say that I'm not too sure right now of what the best places are for finding Chinese science fiction
mm.
um, in 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 the original language. Usually, I'm getting it via the little collected volumes of sort of the annual volumes of the best sci-fi for a given year.
Mm. So you just used a word I recognize there. You said 科学. So there's
Uh-huh.
科幻 and 科学. So since you're a scholar of this stuff, can you tell listeners who've not heard both the two terms contrasted, where they both come from, what the difference is?
Sure. Yeah, 科学 means science, basically, right? Just
Mm,
in the sense that we use the word science. 科幻 is actually short for 科学幻想小说,
mm,
which means sort of scientific fantasy fiction. And that word or that abbreviation, 科幻, came into the language in the 1950s when Chinese science fiction was often modeled on Soviet science fiction.
mm.
And I'm going to absolutely mangle the Russian for
Yes,
this,
do it.
but I think it's the Nauknaya Fantastika or something like that, which also basically is a term from Russian meaning, scientific fantasy fiction.
Nagnaya Fantastica. Well, any
Yeah.
Russian or Russian-speaking listeners, feel free to zap in a correct pronunciation of that. I think some we in episode 19 again it's out as of today. There's some time travel wrangling involved there, but there was a Polish word popped up there, and again, neither me or my guest are Polish speakers, but it is cool to see intersections between Chinese sci-fi and other sci-fi non-English language sci-fi worlds.
Yeah.
Maybe Kushwa I was getting mixed up with that word Lushun created for science fiction.
I mean, so around the turn of the 20th century, actually, rather than 科幻, the term would have been 科学小说,
Right.
which is really a more direct translation of the word science fiction. 小说 is something like fiction or novel, the
Right.
novel. And so at that time, actually, before the genre designation science fiction is really prominent in English. In the in the Chinese language context, you have this being used as a genre category. Although that's it's really pretty fluid, and there are a lot of other things you might also call science fiction. And as far as I know, that sort of made its way over into Chinese through Japanese originally, where you had the same four characters, but kagaku shousetsu, just science novels or science fiction, and kagaku bungaku sort of starting to become an idea where Meiji Japan was also looking at writing science fiction or writing that was about science and adventure and all these other things as sort of a tool of national modernization.
Okay, that's really interesting. I know I keep mentioning various listeners, but I'm trying to do that more. I know that recently some Japanese people, or at least people in Japan who speak Japanese, found the show, and I see from my tracking I'm getting more plays from there. So if any of you guys are listening and you hear Nathaniel talking about this kind of, what would you call it, interaction or exchange or whatever between Japanese sci-fi and Chinese, and if you guys have thoughts, again, please let me know. It's infinitely interesting, and you don't have to be an expert, but if you have anything to say, please do. If you don't, That's fine. That's that little waffle done. Shall we move on to some? I know we already did some kind of translation related questions, but I have some more. So shall we move on to those?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Cool. Let me see. Oh yes, here's a big one. So this story, the English version, is written in the present tense, and I know that if we're putting things simply, Mandarin Chinese doesn't have tenses. So I'm curious, what made you pick English present tense for your translation?
I generally speaking, I would say I've come to find that that works for me.
Mm,
I think it especially works in terms of a lot of Han Song's fiction, in that what's often going on is there's sort of as the narrative unfolds, you're figuring out more about what's going on, but neither the narrator nor the characters nor the reader are really able to get a to become fully appraised of the the reality of the situation. And so I feel like present tense works for that sense that this is unfolding before all of us at the same time.
mm,
Yeah, I guess that's the main reason I would go with that.
that's really interesting. So I know that, as far as I'm aware, there's no Han Song novels that exist in English. Am I right in thinking that?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware as well.
So my question is, if you were to translate one of his novels, like DTA Underground, for example, would you still do the whole thing in present tense, or would you be a bit more conventional and go for past tense?
I feel like I would probably go for present tense. I mean, I think another reason for that is that it's fairly common to have these little bits of flashback that occur within, I guess, any story. But it seems like I've especially noticed that going on in Han Song, who I've translated quite a bit of,
Right.
and so that it makes it easier to make a break with something that clearly is being related as an event that somehow feeds into what's going on now, but happened prior to the narrative.
That's really interesting. I don't, as far as I'm aware, I can't think of any Chinese sci-fi I've read in present tense. But I'll keep an extra eye out for that now because it's an interesting, or indeed any translated stuff. It's an interesting thing that I hadn't thought about before I read this little piece. So next technical question. I was looking for any possibly tricky or interesting words. So we already talked a bit about ennui, but there's another word. It only appears once, but it's just an absolute pleasure to say in English because it's got so many P's. Plenipotentiary. How did you choose that one, and what do you know which, or do you recall which Chinese word it came from?
I have to confess I don't remember which Chinese word it came from.
Mm,
But I think really high on my list of joys of translation, and probably one of the things that's most time consuming, is working with the thesaurus, or the particular volume that I have is called the Synonym Finder, and it's
mm,
by far the most well-worn book on my bookshelf. And so I really enjoy the process, I guess, of you'll read the Chinese and you know what's going on and sort of what basic terms you might use to translate the story, and then it's a question of finding that word that really works well. And I can't remember exactly if this is just what came up in doing sort of a basic word search on something like plecodict. I don't know if
mm.
anyone out there knows what that is, but it's to me, I think, and to most people working in Chinese studies, it's a smartphone dictionary, and it's kind of the gold standard for dictionaries, especially because you can download just entire bookshelves worth of dictionaries onto it.
Mm.
So I'm sure there was a plecodict search on there at some point, and then probably after that, a lot of digging through a thesaurus. Yeah, and that's to the best of my recollection, that's how I got to that, to plenipotentiary.
So just for listeners who are scratching their heads, in the story, the plenipotentiary is the alien who's serving as a representative for the Guardian, the kind of god thing that's running the universe. And I've just got the Google's given me the Oxford definition. So plenipotentiary can be a noun or it can be an adjective. The noun means a person, especially a diplomat, invested with the full power of independent action on behalf of their government, typically in a foreign country. And the adjective, according to the dictionary, says having full power to take an independent action. It's a word I had to look up. But it is a very cool word. And I think in this day and age, I don't begrudge it too much when I have to look up a word in a story because my smartphone's never more than arm's length away, and there's nothing wrong with expanding your vocabulary. The other time Chinese sci-fi has done this to me that I can think of is Ken Leo and topolect, a word he purposely uses instead of dialect. I don't know how many people would have known that word before coming across it in a book. I didn't, but again, it's a handy thing to add to one's vocabulary.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I feel like both of those words are not commonly used, but I love to joke around when I teach courses about sort of, you know, breaking a word apart into its Latin roots or its Greek roots. And it seems pretty clear that like with topo, you know, topo is in topos or is in maps or
Mm,
territories, and lect having something to do with languages, right? And so we can see what's going on there with plenipotentiary. It's got something to do with potency.
mm,
Seems a fair assumption, right? And so we can kind of I feel like we can kind of get there. Yeah,
mhm.
I don't feel like we hear the word topolect very often outside of that very specific meaning that Ken Liu is putting forth there in the introduction to Waste Tide. Um,
Mm. But he could be the one that kind of brings it back into or brings it into mainstream use. You never know.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's absolutely fair, both in literary translation and in academic translation, as you were saying, to expect that readers will have a smartphone at hand, and you can look up terms you don't know, or you can, you know, look up a historical allusion or something like that pretty easily. So I feel like if you can find it on Wikipedia or an online dictionary, it's fair game as long as you're not having to spend, you know, every single paragraph looking something up.
Yeah, you don't want to push it. I have an anecdote about using my phone for just something like that. It was reading Jin Yong's Legend of the Condor Heroes, the translated one from MacLehose. Did you read that?
No, it's on the shelf, something I'm hoping to get to at some point. We'll see
Yeah,
when.
that's how I feel about the enormous sequels. Um, but there's a story from history one of the characters tells about because there's a semi-mythical horse that's in the story, and there's a legend a character tells about how I think the Han Chinese dynasty acquired these horses from a far west kingdom. I forget the name. Maybe I think it was the Han. It might have been the Tang. Anyway, and it seemed very far-fetched, and it kind of was vague about. Well, I think the country was called Fergana. It was called in the text, and it
Uh-huh.
sounded like these might have been Persian or Indian or maybe some other group of people, maybe a group of people who lived in that region who are not there anymore. So I Googled it, and it was in fact a Greek city, one of the leftovers from Alexander's empire. So it was a case in history, a real case of an imperial Chinese army sieging a Greek city, initially being pushed back and then coming back and finishing the job and taking their horses. And that's prompted me to put a history book about said topic, the Greeks in Asia, in like Asia proper, on my Christmas list. So I'll hopefully be reading that next year. But yeah, that's the power of the smartphone, letting you
Yeah, yeah,
not
that's
just word check,
fascinating.
but fact
Yeah.
check too,
Yeah, I mean, reading is just this never-ending rabbit hole, right? Where
unfortunately. Yeah.
yeah, a lot of unread books in its wake. Um,
Yes. Yeah, I've that's the only book on the list just because there's so much stuff on my bookshelf. But yeah, other technical questions. Yeah, so although I already asked you about Ennui, I'm trying to remind myself to on every episode do a word of the day, where I badger my guest on how to say a new word or new word for me anyway in Mandarin. So what again was the word that you got Ennui from?
厌倦.
Yen Juan. Okay.
Yeah, 厌倦.
And its slightly different meaning from Ennui is what was it more related to?
Weariness or
Weariness.
boredom
Hmm.
or uh, yeah, the feeling of being tired.
Okay, so
You know, we
Yen
were
Juan.
talking about uh, tense in Chinese.
Hmm.
The word category, right, can can sort of slip around a lot in Chinese as well. And I think that's one of the fascinating things, is that something can be an adjective or a noun, that can be to be bored, or it can be boredom, right, as well. And so that's another interesting set of decisions one has to make in translating.
Right. Cool. So yen, zhen, ennui / exhaustion, boredom.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much for that. So my last set of questions, they're questions about you, or questions about your endeavors or your interests. So first one, listeners who have been listening to every episode will recognize this one by now. When did you first really connect with sci-fi? Not just Chinese sci-fi, but any sci-fi.
I would say that was probably around the time I was 11 or 12, and in I guess two different ways mainly. One was Philip K. Dick I really got
All
into.
right.
And I guess probably on the timeline, somewhere in there, this is back when VHS tapes were a thing. And so friends and I, would stay the night at each other's houses, and we'd ride our bicycles over to the local video store and find something to watch. And I can remember renting Blade Runner and also renting Terry Gilliam's Brazil, which I would say is kind of a sci-fi dystopia. And at the end of those, just being completely blown away, however old I was. And Brazil doesn't really have much to do with Philip K. Dick, but somewhere around then also discovering Philip K. Dick and really loving him. The other way that I think I got into sci-fi around that time was through the cyberpunk role-playing game. And, friends and I think we would go out and buy any kind of Dungeon Master's Guide or role-playing game rule book we could find. And usually we would kind of create the characters and maybe get through one campaign and then pick up something else. But I remember being really into sort of the visual culture surrounding cyberpunk in its early versions. Then the other thing that I think was going on around the same time, and in kind of a similar, very analog mode of discovery, was finding manga and anime at the local comic book store, and just being completely blown away by the visual culture of that, because there was nothing else around, at least in the town that I grew up in, that in any way resembled what we would find down in this little basement comic book shop with things like Appleseed and Akira and all of those. So that's I would say that's sort of a short version of how I initially connected with science fiction.
So the visuals of some young lads riding on bikes in a group and playing role-playing games, it just makes me wonder, have you seen any of Stranger Things, like the first episode?
Yeah, I have. It's interesting. It's very reminiscent of my childhood, I would say, aside from government funded monster projects coming to life.
Yeah, you avoided that one. That's
but yeah, the role-playing games and riding around on little BMX bikes, absolutely, big part of my childhood.
Sweet. The follow-up question, again, listeners who've listened to the rest of the sci-fi season will know what this one is. What was the first Chinese sci-fi that you read, if you can remember?
I remember this pretty vividly. The first Chinese science fiction novel I read would have been Xin Shi Tou Ji, or The New Story of the Stone. And that's a 1905 novel by Wu Jianren, and one of the earliest works of Chinese science fiction. And I think that at the time I read it, even I wasn't really identifying it as science fiction. The second half of the novel takes place in this futuristic Chinese utopia. The first half of the novel is set in semi-colonial Shanghai. And it was, I had to read that for a graduate seminar and really didn't know what to make of it. I think at the time I could kind of barely read it because it's late Qing fiction. And eventually had this epiphany that I had been reading a book on it by my professor, my advisor, Theodore Hüters, and sort of realized the only thing I had to say about it that he hadn't said was that actually this is sci-fi, right? And sort of just this, that was my moment anyway of discovery that there really was sci-fi in China.
And if it's New Story of the Stone, does that mean it's a riff on the classic Story of the Stone / Dream of the Red Chamber / Dream of Red Mansions?
Yeah. So it's one of many sequels, and there's this sort of self-deprecating commentary at the beginning from the author where he talks about how, I know this is just one more sequel to the, Dream of the Red Chamber, Story of the Stone, but here we go anyway. Here's my take on it.
That's interesting. It reminded me a wee bit when you're saying it has like a utopian China. The one story I know that has something, or maybe one or two I know that have something like that. There's one that Xia Jia describes in her essay at the start of Invisible Planets. I think the story is just called Xinzhongguo, New China. Of course, written a long time before Mao Zedong's New China came about. But I think it shows you a new Shanghai, however many years in the future, where there's what's the word I'm looking for? Accurately enough, a World Expo has been held there, and certain things have been established, like equality of the sexes, which is arguably there today. And I think it's supposed to be a liberal society. That's maybe missing. But that was the one story I haven't read, but I know where it depicts a utopian China. Is that anything like the one in New Story of the Stone, or are they a bit different?
There are a striking number of similarities, and for me, one of the most interesting ones is that actually there's a World Expo type event going on at the end of New Story of the Stone as well. There's a real fascination with that in turn of the 20th century Chinese culture. Yeah.
Honestly, I hadn't heard of World Expos before I lived in Shanghai. Maybe since I live in such a small city, or I don't know. Have they come back in recent years or decades, or have they always been a thing? Do you know?
I mean, well, I don't know if they've always been a thing. I think they were really big in the kind of turn of the 20th century and maybe up through like the 1930s or so, I guess.
I suppose they were interrupted a bit by World War One and Two and the Cold War.
Yeah, that would make sense. And I think that I think outside of China, they're seen as being kind of passé. Although I know that there've been a few World Expos in Japan as well. And there are some old expo grounds in Osaka from, I think, two different World Expos. I'm not exactly sure when. But they're, certainly a really big thing in contemporary China.
Right. There you go. Well, if there's any listeners who knows more about World Expos, I've already given the contact details a few times. It's an interesting topic. Going back a wee bit to Qing fiction, can you tell us a little bit more about your book, Celestial Empire? Because I'm pretty sure it concerns this stuff.
So that book is about the emergence of Chinese science fiction at the turn of the 20th century, and it's sort of I guess in very broad strokes, I would say it's an examination of how colonialism, empire, and Orientalism made their way into or figured in late Qing Dynasty Chinese science fiction. And I had originally sort of hoped for that to cover the entire 20th century, but it turned out that I only really go into about 4 different novels and a couple of short stories in there.
Right.
But yeah, that's sort of an examination of where exactly Chinese science fiction came from and of its relationship to discourses of imperialism.
Right, and that book's completely available on Amazon and similar places, right?
Yeah, and I'm happy to say fairly affordable.
Yeah, well, it's very important for an academic book because some of the funniest things I've seen on Amazon are some of the prices that, not obscure, but non-commercial academic books. Sometimes it's a very simple looking book and the price is like, if you want it, it's £200-300, or I guess like $400-500.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I've been trying to teach myself recently is what exactly the economics are of that, and I can't say I understand it.
I suppose there's one book in supply and no competition, I suppose.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess it goes to a library and they're able to pay that. But,
yeah, I think that's it. It's not really intended for individual consumers, but it's there for anyone who hates libraries.
Yeah.
Interesting. So do you have any new work or new books underway?
Well, I'm not sure exactly how long the new book is going to take, but I'm hoping at some point in the next few years to have a study out, as I was saying, about the figure of the train and its relationship to narratives of development in modern China. in print, and unfortunately probably behind an academic wall, I have an article on another genre that I was sort of alluding to earlier, in this idea that there are these popular science genres in China that I find very fascinating, especially during the late 1950s. And this one is called 科学相声. Basically means science crosstalk. And so these are these little comic dialogues that were made to teach people about popular science, and when they emerged, were especially used to teach people concepts about health and hygiene. So things like washing your hands or disposing of human waste properly might come up. But anyway, that article is titled Locating 科学相声, Science Crosstalk, in relation to the selective tradition of Chinese science fiction. And that appeared in the journal Osiris.
Cool. Do you have any upcoming work on Han Song?
I have a set of translations of his that should be coming out soon, and that's with a press called Dark Moon Books, and that's probably in the next year or so that we should have a volume with a number of stories of Han Song's, and then some short articles about him, as well as a couple of little essays by him. And we're hoping to get one previously unpublished in Chinese work from him that we can then publish in English, so there'll be something there for English language readers that not even Chinese readers would have. We're not, I don't want to talk that up too much because we're still not sure if all of that'll work out, but
Right.
in the next year that should be coming out.
Okay.
And then the ultimate chapter of the book proposal that I have going will be looking at Han Song, and we were sort of talking about how he has all these narratives of people trapped in trains and planes and other vehicles, and how that figures into sort of ideas about modernity in China.
Actually, this is a good spot for me to sneak in a question. I'm guessing you've had a fair bit of experience on the different modes of public transport in China. I mean, I could talk about this stuff for a very long time. Do you have any thoughts on like the high-speed rail network or the metro or even the buses?
I mean, I've been traveling to and have lived in China on and off over the last 20 years. And yeah, it's just absolutely fascinating to see that transformation. When the first time I lived in Beijing, there were two subway lines there. Just that number one, the sort of loop line, and the little red line that went across kind of the bottom of Tiananmen Square. And that's grown into I think it's either the largest or the second largest subway system in the world. And the first has got to be Shanghai, right? So it's going to just be Chinese cities trading places for that for a while, I think.
Funny you should mention that. So this was a few years ago now, so the stats might be out of date, but I think, say 2016, 17, I was being an intern with That Shanghai magazine, and there was a story I was asked to write about the new lines that sounds like I was doing it at the behest of the government. It wasn't that, but we were doing a little piece on some new lines that were being rolled out in the Shanghai metro system. And we had some stats. I think even before these lines were being added, the longest subway system by kilometers of track in the world was already Shanghai. But it was number 2 for the number of passengers. Beijing was number 1 for the number of passengers and number 2 for the kilometers of track. So you're absolutely right. Yeah. And I'm sure it's much the same now.
I mean, I find that kind of fascinating. It's sort of a form of magic to me as well. I said I grew up riding a BMX bike kind of around my neighborhood, definitely no subway system in the city I lived in. And so the idea to me of going underground at one point, and I don't have to pay all that much attention, and I'm just sort of whisked across the city and I pop up out of the ground at this other point in space, is science fictional, if not magical. And on a sort of national scale, I've also seen the development of the high-speed rail system, and it's quite enviable. Just seeing how fast you can get around, and remembering, it used to take 12, 15 hours to get from Shanghai to Beijing, say, and now it's a 5-hour trip, and incredibly affordable. So just absolutely wonderful.
I have to say, like in the UK, the London Underground I quite like. The UK train system, for all its flaws, I love riding the train, and I think our buses are good. But like in Scotland, well, the all of the UK has three undergrounds. There's a London one. That's the only like really sizable one. I think there's another English city that has one. I think it might be Newcastle. And then Glasgow, in my native Scotland's got one, and it's a circular line. And my experience of using it has always been it's just more efficient to get the bus. And there were plans years ago, I think, under our last Labour government, which is a very long time ago now, to build a high-speed line. And for starting at London. So for a Scottish person, that's amazing because logically it should be like a backbone for all of Britain. But the plan initially was to only build it to Birmingham, so barely halfway up England.
Oh, really?
Yeah, insane. And then the plan got extended to maybe go up to like Manchester or all the way up to the north of England, which, that's a little better. But the plan has been kicked back and canned by the different governments that have kind of gone in and out of Westminster and 10 Downing Street. And if you compare that with the rapid progress that's unfolding in China, I mean, granted, it's a bigger country. They have a greater need of fast rail, but it's the contrast is almost hilarious when you think about it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there was, there are similar pushes to have trains going from, say, Washington, D.C. to New York City,
Well, that really makes
or
sense.
yeah, or Los Angeles to San Francisco to have high-speed rail. It makes you almost envious of an authoritarian state because
Hmm.
there's just so little chance of that happening in the United States. Yeah, all the various property lines you have to go through, and the train can only curve so many times in order to maintain the speed that it needs, and so it just seems very unlikely in the United States that we're going to have a high-speed rail anytime soon.
Yep. Yep. And this is something I could talk about more, comparing UK rail with mainland European rail, but I think it's too off topic, so I'll spare everyone. Um, Next question about yourself. What are you reading just now? And are there any other books, Chinese or not Chinese, or concerned with China, not concerned with China, that you'd like to recommend to the listeners?
A lot of what I've been reading these past few months is work I would categorize as Sinophone fiction. So
Hmm.
meaning work that is originally written in Chinese, but is not necessarily from mainland China, or not necessarily written by someone whose first or main language is Mandarin Chinese.
That's interesting.
Um, yeah, so one author that I'd like to, I guess I would recommend, who I'm rereading, but I think is really worth rereading, and fits in that category of very strange stuff, is Ng Kim Chu. That's Ngkimchew, and he has a set of short stories in translation called Slow Boat to China.
Okay.
Just some great, very strange, great stuff from a Malaysian Chinese author. The
Right.
other book that I read recently and my students really disliked, but I think maybe people who are a little more keen on literature would enjoy, is Wu Mingyi's The Stolen Bicycle.
I think I might
Uh,
have heard of this.
yeah, I think the Chinese title is 失窃的单车, but that's available in translation as well, and it's a sort of historical novel from Taiwan.
Yeah.
So we were just talking about our sort of mutual obsession with high-speed rail and subways. I think another obsession that I have is actually with bicycles, and Wu Mingyi's story feeds that. It's also like a really fascinating meditation to me on history and the relationship of objects to history, and so I think it was maybe a bit over the heads of undergraduate students. But for me anyway, it was just a really great novel, and one that I'm sort of still puzzling over.
Mm.
And it hit me in one of those ways where I don't quite get all of it right away, and in a way that makes me feel like there's really something to it that I'll end up figuring out as time goes on and as I continue to meditate on it.
That's something I've still not done is read any translated Chinese stuff from Taiwan. I own one book, Orphan of Asia, somewhere on my shelf, but I've not read it. But I'm planning at some time on the podcast to do San Mao, although I don't know if she wrote prose. I don't know if it's all poetry.
I thought she did sort of travelogues too, but I'm
Oh,
actually,
right.
have to confess my ignorance on that.
That sounds right. Yeah. Actually, another question going back to stuff on tracks again. When you mentioned subways, it popped into my head. Have you been to the Subway Museum in Shanghai?
No, I haven't. When did that open?
It's been open for a while, I think, but it's kind of tucked away. It's just near the Koreatown, quite west the ways, and it's okay. It's not amazing, and I guess it would be all right for yourself. A fair bit of it is only in Chinese. But yeah, I was just thinking if I was Han Song's agent, I would get him to do some kind of an event in there. I think that would be fun.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm doing a research trip this summer to Shanghai and Beijing, and so Subway
Oh, there you go.
Museum fits right in for research work.
Oh, there you go. It's pretty well documented, but yeah, it's kind of in not that central, so it would take a little bit of time set aside to get there, but it's pretty small, so you wouldn't be traipsing around it all day.
Cool.
And it's a little bit of a government showpiece, but I think that's to be expected.
Yeah.
That's me all out of questions. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to say or plug before we bid you farewell.
No, not really. I'm at Twitter at real N Isaacson, but I don't think I'm terribly active there. I'm trying to get better on self-promotion. So,
Okay.
if you're just interested in following me personally, I'm there. I'm also Nathaniel Isaacson on Facebook. I'd be glad to hear from any listeners or continue to share ideas with folks
Mm.
outside of the podcast if they want to
And
get in
yeah,
touch.
and I think anyone who's got academic access, just pop Nathaniel's name into your uni's library, and some cool stuff will pop up. That's for sure, right?
Yeah, I'd have to say so. I certainly enjoy getting to write it.
There you go. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and you're welcome back anytime. Not the next episode, obviously, that would be strange, but you are welcome back anytime.
Glad to be on the podcast. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah, cool. Well, have a nice day in the States. I forgot whereabouts in the States you are.
North Carolina, thank you.
Have a good day in North Carolina.
Yeah, have a great evening over there in the UK.
Yep, and happy Thanksgiving.
Thanks.
Thank you again so much to Nathaniel for being a guest on the show. It really was a great chat we had. Further to what we were talking about access to Chinese literature today, if you fancy reading the sci-fi issue that's got the fundamental nature of the universe and other Nathaniel Isaacson translated Han Song stories and some cool little essays on Chinese sci-fi. To get the individual issue, or indeed any individual issue, the CLT website recommends that you contact them by email, and presumably you can sort something out. I would guess that in British money, GBP, you'd be paying £9 for a single issue for print, because the purchasing options for a subscription, a print subscription that would get you their next two issues, because it's a bi-yearly journal, that would cost you £18, but that wouldn't, I presume, give you access to back issues. For online only subscription, which I guess would give you access to all their stuff, it's £106, quite a lot of money. And for print online, £125, so 106 plus that 18. Well, let's do some maths here. No, that's 19, isn't it? Yeah. Strange that they'd add that one extra pound. I guess they wanted to round it up to a multiple of 5. So yeah, your best option might be contacting them by email, or of course if you're with the university, using academic access or finding a way to get some academic access using your own ingenuity. But yeah, I'll do the plugs now. Speaking of ingenuity, I have to apply my own to help promote the show. So we have Facebook platforms now, a page that you can like and a discussion group that you can join. I'm still kind of seeing if people want to use that. By all means, give it a shot. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you would rather give your thoughts one-on-one to myself, the good place to do that is our Twitter and Instagram, at TrChFic for Instagram. Twitter, just my own one, at Angus Likes Words. You can share your thoughts in a mention, a DM, all those fun millennial things. There are also great channels to get previews on where I'm going with the next few episodes, and also just to see my random thoughts. Or on Instagram, often I kind of repost or put in my moments cool books and things that I see. Yeah, that's the social media. If you want to support the show financially, there's Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon. I have just recorded a very cool Patreon episode, like a bonus thing. It was just me having a chat via Skype with our man Dylan Levi King. So if you enjoyed the episode I did with him, there'll be another one up on the Patreon. And for one-off contributions, there's Buy Me a Coffee. Links to both those platforms will be in the show notes. Of course, last but not least, the most important thing is to spread the word. Of course, tell your dog, but do also tell the God who resides within the universe and watches over, maintaining a manageable level of entropy. Also the AI, who daily is at risk of murdering you just because of its own ennui. Tell the AI you could save your own life. Tell also your friends. It's really important, if to me, that if you know someone who might get something out of this show, it's urgent that you tell them. And on that note, 再见.